Again, welcome back to the session number 4 of this 12th International Forum of Rosenberg on Water Policy. This session will be chaired by myself and Professor Lucia Di Stefano. I will be moderating the first part of the session, and she will be moderating the discussion and, of course, later on, the roundtable. So, as we've been hearing, at least yesterday and today, the deltas seems that they are facing the same, almost same challenges, at least in those deltas that we have been listening to during like today, this morning, and of course yesterday. And these challenges varying from whether it is social, ecological, governance, or like, man-made problems related to the upstream development of the hydropower. So this session will bring, of course, experts from international NGOs, and will bring experts to talk about what is the kind of challenges that Mekong Delta is facing. And of course, there are some also other like issues that we are going to address in terms of financial innovation, financial instrument in order to address some of the challenges that we are facing. And of course, how the proposed, or how we can really talk about solutions, solutions that will help address and improve, or at least overcome these challenges. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Susanne Schmeier, to talk about like financial innovation. So Susanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Does it work? Yes. And I'm not hearing myself double, as I heard the other speakers there, so that's amazing. Yeah, so far super interesting presentations. I will maybe disappoint you, but I'll sort of turn our perspective, turn our view a bit to another topic that we haven't really touched upon so far explicitly, but it's somehow been implicit in a lot of the things we discussed, because we've heard words being mentioned such as investment, need for more funding, building institutions, but then we haven't really talked about the money itself, and I want to do that now, zooming out, keeping a focus on the Mekong, but also looking at a range of other basins. It builds on work that I've been doing both from a research side, but also in some advisory work for the UNECE and for the World Bank, and if I'm using terms that you're not familiar with, please just ask afterwards. I know it's topic-wise a bit different, a bit more legal and a bit more financial than a lot of the other presentations, but there are no stupid questions. So why are we actually talking about money at all? I mean, it's been clear that when we talk about water management, whether that's very local water management, whether that's delta management, or whether that's the management of entire basins, we do need financial resources, whether that is for addressing droughts, addressing floods, generating power, generating electricity, restoring ecosystems, addressing pollution, investing in water security for people and food security. We do need financial resources. And with a large share of the world's freshwater resources being transboundary in nature, with 313 transboundary surface water basins and more than 600 transboundary aquifers, this is also becoming a transboundary and increasingly also an international question. So funding and financing has increasingly not only been a local, a government question, but is taken up to a transboundary and a global level, and I'll talk about some of these mechanisms. But it's also become transboundary in the sense of investments that are being done, especially in all these transboundary basins and aquifers, having transboundary impacts maybe across the basin that might hopefully not have been intended. Just sort of a little word, I'll be speaking quite a bit about river basin organizations like the MRC. You've heard from Kun Busadi yesterday about the MRC as one of the key vehicles of managing transboundary basins and increasingly also being pushed by a lot of international financial institutions as also mechanisms for funding. What we have to keep in mind is that some of these organizations are actually very implementation focused, so have a very centralized basin management functions, so will also very much more be engaged in acquiring financial resources, distributing financial resources, doing investments. And I think the most extreme case, if you want to read up a little bit more on this, is the Senegal River Basin Organization in Western Africa, which indeed manages its own infrastructure, has taken loans from banks for its own infrastructure. Whereas if we look at largely the European side with the Elbe, the Rhine, the Danube, we have basin organizations that are much more coordination-oriented, where a lot of the investments are actually happening at the national level, but still the basin organizations do have a role to play when it comes to coordinating these financial flows, or at least the activities that will ultimately require certain financial flows. But let's look at why we need funding at all, and I think that's something that's a bit under-discussed in the discourse, because we often say, yes, okay, we need funding, but it's not quite clear what we need it for in the basin cooperation process. We can differentiate generally between core costs and program costs. And core costs is basically what Busadi yesterday talked about in terms of having the MRC, establishing a basin organization, funding negotiations for countries to come together, to sign a treaty, to establish a basin organizations, run the whole organization, have the staff in the secretariat, and so on. But then the actual sort of bigger chunk of money that we need is what we often refer to as program costs, which is all the costs that come from monitoring shared water resources, establishing basin management projects, whether that is joint studies, I mean the council study, but also the joint MRC-LMC study we mentioned earlier, or then sort of the next step, infrastructure investment. And we know that we do need these resources, but we also know that they're often underestimated and often not really planned for. There's World Bank studies that show that the funding needs in the water sector are about $7 trillion by 2030 and about $22 trillion by 2050. Not specifically talking about transboundary waters, but water as a whole. But as I said, with 313 transboundary rivers, a lot of that is needed also in these transboundary basins. And if you contrast that with the fact that on average, governments only invest less than 2% of their GDP into water, you can see that there's a huge gap. You can also wonder why there is that gap, and let me not go into that, but think about, for example, recent commitments of NATO countries to 5% defense spending, contrasting this with 2% water spending. But I think that's a bigger discussion that maybe we'll have over lunch. But anyway, there's this huge funding and financing gap, which I think, and that's a bit of a separate research project that we're currently working on at IHE Delft, links a lot to the underestimated benefits of cooperation. Because those taking decisions about how to spend money, which is typically ministries of finance, international banks, private investors, and so on, are not necessarily the ones that are aware of the benefits that transboundary water cooperation, water management, delta management can bring. And often those who benefit from better water management are also not necessarily the ones who have a say, who have a voice when it comes to decision-making, to resources allocation at the national or even the international level. Traditionally, it's been public funding resources that have been used for water management, right? Thinking about water as a public good, thinking about water services very much being in the realm of government, of state functionalities. Traditionally, there has been public funding that goes into water, whether that's into basin organizations, whether that's into basin management activities, and so on. But what we're increasingly seeing, and what I want to focus more on, is the call for private funding. It's international organizations, it's the World Bank, it's different international financing organizations that are pushing, acknowledging the funding and financing gap that I mentioned, to leverage more private funding. The Global Environment Facility, for example, includes an explicit indicator in their monitoring of environment projects, water and also others, how much their funding invested in a basin, a marine ecosystem, how much private funding that leverages in addition. So what we're seeing in the past years is a push to mobilize more private financing, which has brought us in a bit of a dilemma, because if we accept that need, we haven't quite caught up with how that would work and how we would need to build the legal and the institutional basis to actually do so. So what you can see now in many international basins, including here in the Mekong, is that there's an increasing acknowledgement that they want to, they should, whatever you want to call it, leverage private funding, but that the mechanisms are not there. So a number of basin organizations have tried to leverage private funding and financing, but actually struggle with the fact that they might not have legal personality at all, like the Nile Basin Initiative, but that they're also facing a number of political risks that prevent them from actually acting as a funding mechanism. They're typically not, and I don't want to go into too much of the legal details of quite a bit of the work we do around that, but they don't have the mechanisms to ensure liability. They don't have the linkages to the member states that guarantee for the financing to be received, and I'm happy to chat more about that later. But it's quite interesting to see how a number of basin organizations, especially in the Niger, in Lake Chad, so all also, let's say, more complicated, critical, more risky regions have been trying to leverage this private funding but have not quite succeeded. So what is in the current discourse often seen as a response or as a solution to that is what's called innovative financing mechanisms. So that is blended financing, but that is often also climate funds, adaptation fund, green climate fund, and the private capital that potentially can be leveraged through these mechanisms. And many basins have actually engaged with this. So for example, the MRC is actually currently in a process of getting accredited to both GCF and the Adaptation Fund, often struggling with the different settings or the different institutional challenges that come with us. There's, for example, a discussion in the GCF that if countries leverage or if countries request financing through the GCF for work that's been done in their countries, but through the basin organizations, they forgo certain allocations that they could have at the national level. So if you look at decision-making at the national level, ministries of finance typically being the ones who are the focal point for GCF, Adaptation Fund, and so on, their awareness of the fact that basin organizations exist, but also the fact that it might be actually beneficial for the basin to go through a transboundary planning mechanism, a coordinated mechanism among all the countries, is often not there. And the immediate sort of national, especially in the current political climate, the immediate national benefit of going directly for your national allocations under the GCF typically is overriding these transboundary considerations. Or you could also think about, just to give you another example, basin funds. The MRC is trying to establish a basin fund, is struggling to actually leverage the private financing that they're aiming for. Currently it's only being filled by KfW, it's a German development bank. And well, we'll see whether they'll be able to actually leverage private funding. The same in the Okavango, they're trying to establish what's called the CORP fund, so the Kubango-Okavango River Basin Fund, which is an amazing idea, the idea that you could leverage investments that support this absolutely amazing, outstanding natural heritage that we have in the Okavango. But if you asked me if, from sort of an investment security perspective, I would invest my pension in that, no, I wouldn't. So I think there's these big risks around that. And then what I also want to mention, sort of the second dimension of that, is that a lot of the investment that's also happening under these innovative mechanisms can have detrimental effects if not necessarily going through, but is being considered from a transboundary perspective. So there's some interesting recent work by Stu Motta, Johanna Köhler, and Aaron Wolf looking at the financialization of rivers, where they look at the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, under the UNFCCC, where basically, I'm sure you're aware of this, countries, developed countries can, I'm putting it very simplistically, emit a bit more by buying carbon credits, by investing in green projects in the developing world, which in a sense was a great idea when established, but what we're seeing and what Stu and his colleagues show in their recent work is that a lot of these investments are actually going in hydropower projects, massively also here in Southeast Asia, not so much in the Mekong, but a lot in the Red River in China, upstream of Vietnam, where you can wonder what not only the transboundary environmental and social consequences are, but also the effectiveness of these dams themselves in terms of whether that electricity is needed, whether that electricity is actually generated at a cost and at an efficiency that makes sense. But these are all topics that are largely being, or let's say, underrepresented and under-discussed. And all the, sort of while we're still struggling with these, more and more advances are being made by a number of institutions to further push these innovative mechanisms. So Switzerland has been supporting a lot the idea of blue peace bonds, which sounds really cool, right? You invest in peace. Peace that is being generated from water, and the idea is that if countries work together, develop joint water projects, whether that's infrastructure or ecosystem restoration, that creates trust and peace between them. However, the work that has been done on that for the last 5 years has so far unfortunately not led to anything, because all the more legal, administrative and financial questions remain open, but also because I think investing in peace is something that's quite intangible, that's quite difficult. And for private investors to invest in that, as I said, I would also not invest my pension in that as much as I believe in peace through water, is still something that we're struggling with. So what we're seeing ultimately is that we're in a situation where on the one hand we know that we do need more financial resources in the water sector in general, but in the transboundary water space in particular, because the funding gap there is even bigger than at the local or at the national level. But where at the same time, traditional funding is lacking. Governments are investing less and less in water because they're committing it to their 5% defense spending, or because they're facing economic crisis, or for whatever other reasons. Traditional private financing is also not being leveraged because it's not considered as interesting from a return of investment perspective. And these innovative financing mechanisms are promising, but are, let's say, at least underdeveloped and underestablished. So in a lot of basins, we're seeing a situation where we have insufficient or no financial resources, which leads to limited basin management, limited cooperative action, which leads to a situation where countries are not seeing the benefits of managing their river basin jointly, because there's nothing coming out of it, which ultimately leads to less belief, less legitimacy of cooperation, ultimately leading countries not to invest in their basin cooperation. And I think an interesting example is Abakir. It's a basin organization in the Lake Kivu and Ruzizi River, established in 2014 between Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where countries were quite committed in 2015, adopted a convention that gave the Abakir, the basin organization, a whole long list of mandates and roles, but countries have never until now paid any cent of member contribution into that organization. So obviously the organization has not been able to deliver any water management results, leading to a situation whereby now countries have pulled out more and more and more. And this is, of course, an extreme example, but we also have similar examples if we look at Europe. In the Rhine, for example, France has for nearly 10 years now blocked an increase in the ICPR's budget, even for balancing out the losses through inflation. So we're also seeing there increasing challenges in the Rhine due to climate change and emerging pollutants and so on that need attention. But countries being, in light of all the other challenges they face, in light of all the other financial pressures they face, being less and less committed to put in the financial resources. And I think this can trigger vicious cycles that ultimately affect overall cooperation, but also ultimately the people who depend on these water resources and the ecosystems. In addition, and I think I've highlighted this a bit with the CDM example and the investments in hydropower under carbon credits, we have the challenge that with a lot of these financial mechanisms, even if they work, they come with certain social and political challenges, especially with regards to the equity dimension. And this is, of course, a tricky question because financial decisions are being made by the ministries of finance, being very much negotiated at the national level. Even if you have federal systems where provinces or federal states have a say, they're typically not involved in negotiations with either private investors or the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund or whatever private or state-run bank that is investing, which ultimately leads to tensions between, yes, we need money, any money, to invest in the water sector, and the long-term implications, what's actually being done with that money. And in addition to all of that, we're facing increasing challenges. We're facing economic crisis. The investments in the water sector are going down. We see that in Europe, we see that everywhere in the world in terms of national funding, but we also see that in terms of international support. Global Environment Facility is currently going through its replenishment cycle for GEF 9. I think donors will not be as generous as they've been in the previous replenishment cycle, which will also affect support to international waters. And also private investors are becoming increasingly careful, let's put it this way, when it comes to investing into what's considered risky, and transboundary is often considered risky. And at the same time, we have a trend where everyone wants to make their country great again, where we have then the financial challenges with unilateral resources development challenges clashing. So ultimately, and I know it's a bit doom and gloom, but that leads us to a situation where we have a very complex financial dimension when it comes to transboundary water management, but triggering down all the way to the very local level, because it's the local people ultimately who depend on the water resources who will be affected by no investments, but who will also be affected by investments that have negative transboundary implications. We have a situation where long-term implications are often not considered, and where the multi-level elements, and especially the equity, is not being considered. So to end on a more positive note, I think what we're also seeing in the past through work that's been done, especially by the World Bank, but also by UNECE, is an increasing dialogue. So since a few years, we're seeing banks, we're seeing private investors coming to water meetings, engaging in that discussion. And there is, around this blue financing, at least a discussion that has started. I'd say it's not really yielding results yet. If you look, for example, at green bonds and green and sustainable investments, figures show that water is at around 1% to 4% of all sustainable bonds out there. Clearly very limited if you think about the role that water plays in any environmental considerations, but at least that discussion has started. And I know that was a very quick run through a complicated and slightly out of place topic, but I hope I've opened your eyes for this sort of additional important dimension. Happy to chat more afterwards, and if you want a summary with lots of examples, lots of case studies, I would refer you to this publication, which I wrote a few years together with a colleague, me from the legal perspective, him from the investment perspective. I think that gives you a good overview, but also happy to be contacted anytime. Thank you.
Great.